Dad, help! I can't find Nintendo 64 games on the Switch's online service.
Sorry, bud, but they're not on there.
Ugh, when will they be? I'm tired of playing dusty old NES and Super Nintendo games. I want to play Daikatana and Mario 69.
Well, to be honest with you, boy, probably not anytime soon. In fact, I'd even bet your lunch money that Game Boy games are gonna pop up first. That is, unless one particular monkey wrench changes things anyway.
What? Daddy, but why would Game Boy games come first? And what kind of a monkey wrench are you talking about? Well, crack open a can of non-alcoholic horse water, and I'll tell you why Game Boy games are probably coming to the Switch's online service before 64 games, and what just might prevent that from happening. Dad, who are you talking to?
Shut up, butthole!
Okay, so with Super Nintendo coming right after NES games, the 64 does seem like it'd be the next logical step. I mean, after all, those were the three platforms that were on the Wii's Virtual Console on day one. But according to a Blockbuster employee I was talking to the other day, 64 emulation's a bit tricky, even for Nintendo somehow, and when they put these games on the Wii, they had to make emulators for each specific game just so they'd run properly, which is why there were only a handful of them. So given all the extra effort involved, it seems a bit odd that Nintendo would just give them away for free on the online service. I mean, I know we already gotta pay for the online service, but most people are only doing so for Smash and Splatoon. However, as complicated as 64 games may be, Game Boy games, on the other hand, would be just as easy as copy and pasting over like they do with NES and Super Nintendo titles. And like, yeah, the Game Boy's library did have a lot of watered-down versions of NES and Super Nintendo games, but there were still more than enough original titles that make the Switch's online service significantly better. Besides, the Switch is a portable after all, so it kinda makes sense to add more games to the service that are meant to be played on the go. Then again, while throwing some Game Boy games on the service would be like 1,000 times easier, and that people would actually play and enjoy most of them, I don't think it'd convince anyone who's not subscribed to the service to go ahead and sign up. I mean, Nintendo already supposedly made emulators for their best 64 games on the Wii and Wii U's Virtual Console, so it probably wouldn't be that hard to get them running on the Switch. But I mean, it'd still at least be more work than the Game Boy games, and honestly, while I'm sure some people would probably sign up just to play a few 64 games, I don't think it'd make Nintendo a whole lot of money, especially when there's really not that many 64 games that sell the service. Don't get me wrong, the absolute best 64 games are some of the greatest of all time, but aside from the cream of the crop, the rest of the library's just kinda there. Not to mention there'd be licensing issues for games like GoldenEye and No Mercy, and while the NES and Super Nintendo have some really obscure games pop up every now and then on the Switch, I find it hard to believe that obscure 64 games would be worth the hassle of figuring the emulation situation out for. Although I will say, I wouldn't be too surprised if Nintendo worked something out with Microsoft to get games like Banjo-Kazooie on there. However, there's absolutely no way in hell that the above-average sized end would want an M-rated game like Conker's Bad Fur Day on there, or even something like Resident Evil 2 for that matter. However, while I don't think adding 64 titles will get very many new people to sign up for the service, I do think there'd be a good chunk of the 26 million people who already are subscribed to upgrade to a premium online tier. I mean, personally, I wouldn't do it just for 64 games, but if there were online multiplayer for titles like Smash Bros, I could certainly see a lot of people caving. I mean, seeing as how like 90% of people who've ever owned a Game Boy probably never played with another human being outside of using the link cable for Pokemon, it would be pretty cool for people to try multiplayer for some of the other games for the first time. But then again, outside of Pokemon, there really isn't any reason to play a two-player Game Boy game, so the 64 would easily be like 1,000,000,000,000 times more appealing for the Switch's online service as far as multiplayer is concerned. That is if Nintendo could actually make the performance of their service an ass hair better anyway, but I mean, if they had a more expensive premium tier, then they'd definitely have to give us dedicated servers rather than just a handful of 20-year-old games. Personally though, I kinda feel like if Nintendo had plans on doing that, then it would have already happened by now. So going off of what they've done in the past, I think it'd be way more likely for Nintendo to only offer 64 games to people who buy the inevitable upgraded Switch model. After all, they only let you buy Super Nintendo games on the new 3DS model when they could have definitely had them run on the original model. And I know some people believed Nintendo when they said that they couldn't get those games running on the original 3DS, but since the thing could play Game Boy Advance games, I tend not to believe that even for a second. I mean, after all, I can play 3DS, GameCube, and Wii games, so what kind of a dingus you'd take me for? Plus, some random guy got Doom running on a pregnancy test in his spare time for free, so I'm sure a billion-dollar company could have had their own 30-year-old games running on their own hardware that's much more powerful than the Super Nintendo. All I know is that I'm sure emulation on the original Switch model would probably work just fine, but I'm sure Nintendo is going to make us pay for an upgraded model to play them anyway. But even though it wouldn't surprise me to see 64 games locked on an upgraded Switch, I do think it'd ruffle a few feathers, so to prevent that from happening, I suppose Nintendo could drop 64 games on the Switch Pro, while at the same time offering Game Boy games for everybody. Then again, Nintendo's been known to be a little stingy when it comes to their legacy content, so I wouldn't hold my breath over that. If I were calling the shots though, and Lord knows that I should be, then that's what I'd do anyway. At the time of this recording, though, there's really no way of knowing just what Nintendo's gonna do, but I can definitely say with 100% certainty that they will absolutely re-release Game Boy and 64 games again at some point. And if I had to bet, then I'd say that it's much more likely that they're gonna put Game Boy games out first, just because of how much cheaper and easier it'd be. Plus, there's also way more Game Boy games to offer as far as quantity is concerned, many of which have been played by far fewer people than all the best 64 titles, which would essentially make them feel more fresh.
But anyway, let me know which console you think's gonna pop up on the Switch's online service first, and which one you personally want more. And if you're new here, then you might also like my video where Atlas tells me to cut a broken 3DS cartridge in half for a download code. If you'll excuse me though, Cameron Jr. here is about to put on his work boots and respirator, because I had to pull a lot of strings to get him to hire an 8-year-old at my job.
Later!
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.